New research out today shows Australian authorities failed to take effective steps to protect vulnerable people from catastrophic flooding in Lismore in February. Joining me to discuss this is Human Rights Watch Australia researcher Sophie McNeill. Sophie, thanks for your time. Take us through this research. What were the biggest failings you identified?
Thanks, Matt. Well, yes, we went to Lismore and we interviewed a whole bunch of people, older people, people in their 80s, people with disabilities in wheelchairs, with hearing impairments, because we wanted to know how did they fare during this crisis. We know that everyone in Lismore had a really hard time, and a lot of people, faced the fact that they were going to drown in their homes if it wasn't for the bravery and courage of their neighbours and friends who came to their rescue. But those people who are most at risk, they really suffered the most, and they had some terrible stories. What we found is that the New South Wales authorities failed to provide adequate warnings, adequate evacuation assistance and adequate rescues as well, Matt. So it really was a failing across the board, and we just hope that what the failures that we saw in Lismore, we're going to learn the lessons from that, because New South Wales, as we know, is facing another La Nina weather pattern this coming summer, and as these kinds of extreme weather events become more common under climate change, we need to protect those most at risk moving forward, because they will suffer the most.
So what was the problem here? Was there a lack of planning, or was it the fact that in the planning, not enough focus had been put on these people, the most vulnerable people in the community? Where did this go so badly wrong in your view?
Yeah, look, our research definitely showed that there was a lack of planning, but, that was backed up by the New South Wales Flood Inquiry that also really collected the evidence that showed that. But I think it's alarming that the authorities just seem to have no idea where those most at risk were, where people who had no mobility were, people in wheelchairs. People were told at 8 or 9 o'clock the evening before the massive flood hit to evacuate. But these were people in their 80s who couldn't walk, they had no vehicles, and they were offered no assistance to evacuate. So we're calling on the New South Wales SES and emergency services around the country to learn the lessons from these failures, because it just was heartbreaking to hear how absolutely abandoned these people were. And yes, a lot of people in Lismore felt completely abandoned, but if you can't walk, if you can't hear, if you have real mobility issues or any kind of disability, it's even worse. It's even scarier. And when you're totally abandoned, then your risks of survival, are much worse.
The SES obviously has to deal with an evolving situation on the ground, often in pretty difficult circumstances. I mean, is part of the key to making sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again, that the government or the local council area actually goes out and maps, where vulnerable people live, so that they can know, okay, here's where someone who is a person with a disability lived. We need to make sure we take extra care of them. We know elderly people live here, so that they have a better view, if you like, of what the whole community looks like, rather than just going in and trying to treat everyone the same?
Exactly. That's exactly what we're calling for. But much better planning that puts these kind of communities right at the forefront. And so it's about specific messaging services. So, making your warnings available to people, who can't read properly or who can't hear properly. We interviewed people in their 80s who didn't know how to use smartphones. So they really didn't see the warnings that were happening that night. They didn't have the radio on. They're not on the bomb weather app on Facebook. So, we know a lot of that information that people found out about the flood was from social media. And, if you're in your 80s and you don't know how to use a smartphone, how are these warnings going to reach you? So we were quite pleased to have the SES come back to us and say, look, we're trying to find ways to improve. And they've instigated a whole new range of measures in the wake of the New South Wales flood and their failure there. So we're pleased about that. But we just think this needs to be an absolute priority moving forward, because what climate change does is that it exacerbates existing inequality. And so we know that these most vulnerable, these most at-risk communities are going to suffer the worst in the years ahead if we don't come up with adequate plans that place their needs at the forefront. And Matt, we've actually seen this around the world. So Human Rights Watch is doing work right now on the ground in Bangladesh. We've seen this happen in Canada, where they had extreme heat last year and several hundred older people died. So it really is those vulnerable people in our communities that we need to keep in mind as this extreme weather gets worse under a changing and warming planet.